Gaudier. Thank you all for coming down today. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida. So a note to our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, you can just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We'll have the author sign it, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Well, this evening, Books and Books is very pleased to welcome Professor Amina Gautier and her new book, Now We Will Be Happy. Professor Gautier teaches in the Department of English at the University of Miami. She is a winner of the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction. Her work has appeared in numerous literary journals, and she is the author of the previous story collection, At Risk. Now We Will Be Happy is the winner of the Prairie Schooner Book Prize in Fiction. In it, Professor Gautier brings us a collection of stories about Afro-Puerto Ricans, U.S. mainland-born Puerto Ricans, and displaced native Puerto Ricans who are living between spaces while attempting to navigate the unique culture that defines Puerto Rican identity. Please give a very warm welcome to Professor Amina Gautier.
Hi, thanks for coming, and thank you to Books and Books for having me. This is an excellent space. I hope I can come back many more times. I'm going to read the title story, which is eponymous, so Now We Will Be Happy. Tostones make no excuses. Plátanos, plantains, burn in hot oil, their golden edges blackening before she remembers them. Smoke invades her nose and throat, a dark burning smell of food and melting metal, the smell of the frying pan's handle overheating. She is careful to keep her distance when she turns the fire off. She gives the oil time to resettle, steering clear of its pop and hiss, knowing too well just how long burns take to heal. This is the price of looking. She'd ignored the frying tostones for her own beckoning face, following her reflection as it wavered in the chrome hood above the stove. Despite the dullness of the metal, the bruises showed through clearly. She thought they wouldn't show this time, yet an hour after Pedro left, the faint marks darkened, unfurling like blooms across her face. Rosa plucks the tostones from the pan with her spatula and slides them one by one onto the wooden tostonera, where the oil seeps into the fibrous threads, drenching the wood dark wet. Centering the golden wedge, she lowers the handle, forcing the two wooden ends to meet, crushing the plantain flat. The tostones that emerge are hopeless. Instead of perfect golden discs, they are charred beyond recognition, black around the edges and raw at the center. Pedro would never eat them, but Yauba is not so demanding. She can't let him see her like this. They had only to swallow, only to taste. Across the serving line, on the other side of the sneeze guard, the residents came and went without ever once raising their eyes. Taking no notice of Yauba, these international girls, Japanese, Italian, and German mostly, who had come here for school, lifted fingers and pointed to what they wanted, held their plates up to the gloved hands that dished their helpings. Their lodgings, their meals were all covered. Their rooms had been supplied, furnished, and were cleaned weekly by housekeeping. They did not have to clean. They did not have to cook. They had only to be on time for meals served 3 times daily. They had only to take a tray, gather silverware, and decide between meat or vegetarian options, only to walk down the line and select their dessert from ramekins of pudding, gelatin, or cubed fruit. If ever they looked past the clear-gloved hand and the long slotted spoon, it was only to ask about sodium levels and ingredients to which they were allergic. What did they know of corrugated metal and zinc roofs, these girls who had never to see, never to speak, only to swallow, only to taste? Rosa is nothing at all like them, Yauba reminds himself as he scans the room of women oblivious to his presence and finds himself free for the day from feeding the privileged. Fresh from the manager's office, Yauba passes back through the residence's cafeteria, through a room full of women who pay him no notice, who see him not at all. Rarely does he see the view from this side of the serving line. To his way of thinking, the place where the women eat is far more dining hall than cafeteria. There are no long wooden tables or stackable chairs. Each chair is covered in fabric. Each table seats only 4. Linen tablecloths are topped with squares of glass weighted down by vases full of fresh flowers. Women walk across patterned carpet and make their way down the serving line. An elderly woman sitting at the end of the line, behind the one cash register, checks the residents' names off her list when they show their trays. In this expansive space, the women sit, eat, linger, and laugh over the food Yauba prepares. But he has not prepared today's food. Today, he has been suspended. Before he could even change into his checks and clock in, Jim had called him into his office and gave him the news that he could not stay and work. Connie, the new hire in the kitchens, had accused several of the men of sexual harassment, and Jim was putting them on ice until he could get to the bottom of it. She had not named Yauba specifically, had not actually accused any of the men by name. The kitchen workers were a brown coalition of Caribbean men from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Venezuela, and Colombia, and she knew none of them by name. Yauba pushes aside his anger at Connie, who knew nothing about cooking, wanting the hotel pans where the half pans belonged, and using the vegetable cutting boards for meat, who turned her mouth down at the corners whenever the men spoke Spanish, vain enough to believe that a practice they'd adopted years before her arrival was now done with the intention of making her feel uncomfortable. He pushes aside anger at Jim's underhandedness and Connie's cowardly act of accusing him without positive identification, at the inconvenience of having to ride all the way back to Brooklyn when Jim could have saved him the trip with a phone call. He pushes aside his anger at Jim for finally making him second cook, but never raising his salary, for holding the bait of a pay raise over his head while making him do the inventory, the meal planning, and budgets, the work of the food director and head cook, all on his regular salary. 2 years ago, Jim had promised to make him assistant manager when the position opened up, and then passed him over for a 25-year-old tow-headed boy. Thanks to the Jones Act, no Puerto Rican is an immigrant, a fact Jim always pretends not to know. He hates to pay him his due, give him his rights, treat him like the citizen he is. Anger does him no good in a place like this. Not when Jim can take his salary and use it to hire 3 immigrants and pay them under the table. Thoughts of the restaurant he dreams of owning push aside the anger. One day he will go home. Once there, he will open a restaurant. He will call it Selina's, and everyone will come and eat. One day, these things he puts up with will be worth it. He can see it now. It will be nothing like this dining hall. It will be simple and suited to its climate. There, the whitewashed walls. There, the big square-cut windows. And overhead, just there, the ceiling fan with its wings slowly circling. With each revolution of the imaginary fan, his anger ebbs until it is safe for him to go and see Rosa. He has made a promise never to visit her angry. Yauba lifts a tostón, withered and black, to his mouth and tests it between strong white teeth, a jeweler testing gold. Not bad for your first try, he says, but maybe we should start again. Rosa hands him a fresh green plantain and sets the flame under a new, clean pan. With a thick-handled knife, Yauba pries the tough skin away from the starchy meat inside. Then he cuts the plantain into wedges and drops them onto their sides into the sizzling oil. With a steady hand, he rolls them, coating them evenly. She watches, transfixed by the quiet grace of his hands, the strength and steadiness of his fingers. In a shirt unbuttoned at the wrists, its cuffs turned back from the dark skin, Yauba seems too rugged to be cooking, too quietly assured to be standing in the kitchen beside her. She did not plan to desire this man, with eyes as dark as coffee beans, set in a face weathered by time and age. His face has none of the masculine prettiness she has been taught to call beauty. He is not handsome like Pedro, not guapo. He does not have Pedro's height or bulk. Yauba is skinny, flaco, thinner than thin. No, she did not plan to desire Yauba, but now all she wants is to live beneath the touch of his hands. You cooked yours too long. Each one should be like a little bit of sunshine, Yauba says, after crushing a plantain slice between the tostonera and sliding it back into the oil. 6 yellow circles sizzle in the frying pan, simmering beneath a layer of oil, hardening and crispening. When Yauba removes them from the pan, each toston has a golden face. The thready veins that run along the side of the plantain, now flat, look like emanating rays of sun. Each toston looks as if it is smiling. When they come together, they do not talk about their day. He does not tell her that Jim sent him home early on an unwarranted suspension. She does not say how many layers of makeup it takes to conceal. They forget the hours that have come before and the people that have come between them. This time, when the tostones come out, they are perfect. Yauba places them on a paper towel before her, and Rosa pats them dry. He sprinkles salt from his palm onto the chips, and the two lift the still hot tostones to their mouths, not bothering with plates, eating them together as they lean over the sink, eating them hot, salty, and crisp. Who made you like kitchens? She asks. I don't like kitchens, he says, thinking she has made it sound as if he is not a man. I didn't mean it that way. I've been cooking since an early age, he says, almost forever. But who taught you how to make Spanish food? Your mother? It's not Spanish food, he says, an edge in his voice. The only thing Spanish about Puerto Rican food is the onions, the olives, and the garlic. These plantains came over from Africa on the same boats as the slaves. What slaves? She asks, wondering how Yauba and everyone else knew so much more than she. The slaves that brought the plantains, yams, okra, and gandules. The Tainos had yuca, corn, lerén, yautía, guava, soursop. Our food is criolla, just like the people, a mix of all 3 cultures, just like us. She hears in his voice what she sees in the eyes of men whenever they spot the bandera waving from a car's antenna, a caressing love for a place she has never seen and cannot call to mind. So who taught you? She asks again. Your mother? Not my mother, he says, thinking of the aunt who took care of him and of her last days when he returned the favor. With age, his Titi Selina's hands had become arthritic and her taste buds eccentric. She would call in the morning for flan. At night, she'd ask for eggs. She dreamed the dreams of a gourmand, awaking to ask for hams and roasted pork shoulders, pastelillos and pumpkin flan, rice and pigeon peas, apples cored and stuffed with raisins, dishes her hands could no longer prepare. Someone else. Rosa waits in silence to see if he will say more. She does not care that she is being unreasonable, that he had a life before he met her, that she is the one with the spouse. She is jealous now of the mystery woman from his past who taught him to stand here beside her in a kitchen and feel completely at home. Well, she did a good job, she says. Come and see me tomorrow, he says. I'll make lunch. These are not the rules, and well he knows it. They are only to meet here, only on the 4th floor, only in her apartment where he can pretend to be visiting others he knows, where no one will notice or care when he enters or exits the building. I'm going to see my parents tomorrow. Come after. These are not the rules, and though she knows she shouldn't do what he asks, she knows for certain that she will. Kidneys consumed the lives of Rosa's parents, and Rosa doesn't remember it any other way. Weak kidneys kept her father in bed and her mother distracted. By the time she was in 4th grade, her father had become a prisoner to the back bedroom, and her mother had become his caretaker. The señora left the house only for groceries, prescriptions, and trips to the doctor. Made wary by too many misdiagnoses, her mother accompanied her father to his thrice-weekly treatments. First, the doctor said he was anemic, then that he had gallstones. It took 2 years of her father vomiting up what looked like coffee grounds, 2 years of him sleeping more and more hours a day and still waking tired, 2 years of pain every time the ball of a joint pressed into a socket before they discovered that one of his kidneys was only 5% functional. Though she little understands anything about the illness, her parents can speak at length about urea, phosphate binders, and degenerative bone disease. Mom, did you know there were slaves in Puerto Rico a long time ago? The senora listens to her daughter with one ear as she works to cook a meal that will not cause her husband anguish. The senora is careful, so careful, to limit the potassium, phosphorus, and sodium levels of the food she prepares. So careful that Rosa feels like a nuisance come to bother her. Only months since she and Pedro moved out, yet each time Rosa visits, her mother looks more peaked and tired. Mom, slaves, Puerto Rico. Did you know? Her mother runs water over a pot filled with potatoes, then sets the pot on the stove's back burner, hoping to reduce their potassium levels by soaking. She looks up from the potatoes, brushes hair out of her face. Of course, she says, eyeing her daughter strangely. Everybody knows that. How? Her mother takes Rosa's arm, unfolds it at the elbow, and holds her own arm close beside her daughter's. She gestures to their brown skin. Did you think Spaniards and Indians could make this all by themselves? Rosa adjusts her sleeve, tugging it over the dark marks. She offers to help with the meal, but her mother doesn't need her. I've got it under control, the senora says. Can I get you anything? I'm fine, Rosa says, wondering why visits have to go like this, why she has to be addressed formally, why there is never anything she can do to help, why she has to be served like a guest in a restaurant rather than treated like a daughter come home. Do you need me to run to the store and get anything for you? The senora shakes her head. She fixes a plate of cauliflower and boiled chicken legs. Is Dad up? I think I'll go say hi. Now is not a good time for hi. I'm getting ready to bring him his lunch. I have a hard enough time trying to make him eat. If he sees you, he'll get too excited and I'll never be able to get anything in him. The senora pours half a glass of 7-Up and takes the glass and plate in hand. I'll be right back. Minutes pile upon one another before Rosa makes her way down the hall to her old bedroom, tired of waiting for her mother's return. In the months that she and Pedro have been gone, her old bedroom has been turned into a laundry room of sorts. Stacks of folded, clean linen sit on her old bed and wet clothing hangs over the headboard. In the space between the bed and an armoire Pedro insisted they leave behind, her mother has erected an ironing board. Rosa lifts the tall can of starch and fingers the long-sleeved shirt hanging by its collar off the ironing board's narrow end. This is her father's shirt, and even though he has nowhere to go, nowhere to be, her mother still presses and starches his shirts. The sleeve is cool to the touch. Rosa runs her fingers down the empty sleeve, holding the cuff and swinging it. She has thought of leaving Pedro and coming back home, but her parents have enough worries. If she came home, she'd have to tell her father why, and that she cannot do. How long since she has known the safety of the four walls of this room? Rosa sits gingerly on the edge of her old bed, far from the abandoned doll lying on the pillow, and remembers that she has not known safety in this room. He doesn't have to look down at his hands. He knows what he is doing. He is at home with the polished steel and aluminum equipment, with the bain-marie, the hotel pans, the 6 pans, and the rivets, as he is with the caldera, pilon, and tostonera. He dissolves a cake of raw brown sugar into a pitcher of water to make agua de panela. He fluffs the rice. He chills the flan. Whether here or on the job, there is always something to be prepped, stirred, steamed, basted. That is why he has devoted so little time to his decor. But now that Rosa is coming over, Yaoba sees everything with new eyes, her eyes. It is not an apartment a woman would like. There are no plush sofas or overly large leather chairs, no graceful touches. The only flourishes, if they can be called such, are in his kitchen where he keeps his implements. Silver knives gleam, hung with precision. His apartment is as neat and lifeless as a barracks. How bare, how small she makes his apartment seem, how tiny his life before her. He should have pictures for his walls. He should have plants, something, anything to make her feel welcome, to make her want to stay. There's not enough time for him to run out and buy anything. He will have to make do. He has been taught to make use of any and everything. His titi found a use for every part of a pig, making mondongo out of tripe and morcilla out of pig's blood. She taught him to give thanks, make do, and take nothing for granted. His titi could take a seed and turn it into a snack. He could and would take nothing for granted, least of all the love of a married woman he cannot stop himself from seeing. Inside the refrigerator's vegetable bin, he finds fresh cilantro and parsley. He fills 2 plastic cups with water and floats the herbs on top. He places the cups on his windowsills. There, that should do it. Now he has plants. After the first mouthful of arroz con gandules, Rosa knows that this is love. At first, she thinks the love overwhelming her, triggered by the taste of the rice, pigeon peas, and green olives, is for the dish and not the man. But after chewing and swallowing, she knows better. It is the man whose hand holds the spoon that she loves. It is a shame he is not her husband. What do you think? Yauba asks. At first, she doesn't wish to speak, thinking that words will make the all-consuming love go away. Tentatively, she says, delicious. And wonder of wonders, the love is still there. It is not the food he has prepared, nor the way he holds out the spoon for her to taste, as if she is a critic with a discerning palate, that makes the moment special. It is the words that precede the spoon, the sentences that come before the swallow. Yauba brings the spoon to her lips and says, my aunt, my Titi Selena, taught me how to cook. This was her favorite. When I open my restaurant, I'm naming it after her. This dish will be my specialty. As they eat, he tells her about living with his aunt. Rosa can see the small boy that was Yauba sweeping dust from the walkway in front of his aunt's house. Yauba makes her see the rainy nights, hear the patter of the rain on the corrugated metal, the ping of water droplets against the zinc rooftop. How cool the air that comes afterward, lingering at the windows, refreshing him after a long day of errands and chores. She sees the concrete walls, his aunt's Santeria shrine at the back of the house with its gifts of corn and coffee for the orishas. She envies Yauba his stories, covets his memories. Her own memory is of nighttime chatter. When they thought her asleep, her parents would converse in soft-spoken Spanish. With their door left open and the volume of the television turned down low, they would talk late into the night. Betrayed by the refuge her parents saw in the intimacy of their private language, she'd crack open her door at night after her mother had shut it and fall asleep to the incomprehensibility of words, believing that if she listened hard enough, eventually she would understand all that was being said. The girl she had been had longed to know what her parents knew, but the woman she became had long since given up. Her parents weren't telling, and her husband Pedro used her ignorance against her. Yauba believes he has distanced her with his ramblings. I'm sorry, I'm boring you. I didn't mean to go on. How about some music? Though she would rather hear more, she joins him at the stereo. He fiddles with the radio tuner, switching among 3 all-Spanish stations. Ah, this is a good one. Ahora seremos felices. He turns to her, smiling. Know what that means? She says no with a smile, feeling no embarrassment, smiling simply because he is smiling too. It means now we will be happy, he tells her. It's Rafael Hernandez. Even she knows of El Jibarito. He lived among a stack of record albums crowded into a milk crate in the bottom of her parents' closet. He lived among a host of musicians, Lavoe, Nieves, Palmieri, Puente, that her parents listened to only in her absence, only when they thought her asleep. It's beautiful, she says. Dance with me, Yauba says, but she doesn't know the steps. She gives him her hand and lets him show her. Yauba pulls her into arms stronger than they seem, and the two are not really dancing, are barely even moving. She is merely swaying in the circle of his arms, following as he directs her movements. He holds her steady with subtle pressure, but without force. the same way he steadies the knife for the tostones. Her feet barely lift from the ground. There is just a subtle shifting of weight as she drifts between the safety of his arms and the words. As they dance, Yaoba sings words which have no meaning for her. Her parents should have told her the things Yaoba already knew. Instead, they'd kept their secrets. Everyone knew more than her, it seemed. Whenever she asked Pedro, he used the language against her, wielding it like a weapon, mocking and ridiculing her, telling her to look it up, as if she were a lazy child attempting to cheat her way out of vocabulary homework. He'd never missed an opportunity to let her know that he'd gotten less than he bargained for in marriage to her. But how can she ever look it up when she doesn't know where to start? She is tired of not knowing, tired of being left out. Cariña, why are you crying? When he reaches out to touch her cheek, she flinches. She can't help it. I want to go, she says. Immediately he releases her. I would never hurt you. I just wish I could see it, she says. I want to go with you when you open your restaurant. More than anything, it is what he wants too. I'll take you, he says. I promise. I wish we could go right now, she says. Come what may, she decides that she will have this one thing. She will take Yaoba's love and keep it all to herself. We can, he says. When she raises dubious eyes to him, he says only, wait here. 10 minutes later, he returns for her and leads her down the hallway. She thinks he intends to take her to the bedroom, but he bypasses it and brings her into the bathroom. What are you doing? She asks. We're going to Luquillo Beach, he says. He hands her a t-shirt and a pair of shorts similar to the ones he has changed into. You can put these on. She steps out of her sandals and lifts her dress over her head. When she has changed clothing, she allows him to guide her into the half-filled tub. He dips a hand into the water and snaps his fingers beneath the surface, creating a wrinkle of water. The ripple becomes the ruffling of wind over water, the kisses of waves. With her eyes closed, she can see what Yaoba describes. The warm tub water is the Atlantic Ocean, lapping at the edge of the beach. The bare bathroom light bulb is the warm sun in the sky beating down upon her. Yaoba joins her in the water, making it rise to the rim of the tub as he settles in behind her. One of us should stop us, she says, though she knows it is now too late. Not me, says Yaoba. Not me, says Rosa. Her back to his chest, they lie back in the water, bathing in Yaoba's makeshift ocean. Saying nothing, he washes each of her fingers and each web of skin in between. He lifts her arms and washes the dark marks tenderly. He touches her without lewdness, makes her forget all about Pedro, makes her know that bruises can heal. The bruises fall from her the way rain, gathered in the large folds of banana leaves, pours off in a rush when it has become too heavy to hold. When he is done, and she is cleaner than she has ever been, he tells her the meanings of all the words she has ever wanted to know. Thank you. So now I'm happy to answer questions if there are any from the audience. Anthony?
Have you written anything in the magical realism realm? Because I hear little seeds of magical realism in this story, and I was just wondering, is at any moment I expect it, something magical, although something magical does happen.
Thank you. I'm pretty firmly lodged in the world of realism, but I do play with a tiny bit of magical realism in this particular collection. There are 2 or 3 stories where a character's intense passion or desire for something allows that character to think that he or she has transformed his or her present world into something that may or may not be there. So Rosa desires so badly to see Puerto Rico that she's willing to believe that the tub has transformed into the Atlantic Ocean. And there was another story in the collection called Bodega, where one of the co-owners of the corner bodega, she and her husband spend the hour sort of preparing the shop to be opened. And while her husband is downstairs sort of bringing things up, she pretends that she flies to Puerto Rico every day during that hour and goes back and looks at her, her old home. So there's hints of it, but not quite Julia Alvarez or Toni Morrison. Emma?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your relationship to Puerto Rican literature in the island. If you read it, if you're interested in how the Puerto Rican writers who are doing in Spanish, or also using English in their language, but primarily publishing in Spanish, are doing, and if so, how do you dialogue with it?
Well, I'm not actually fluent in Spanish. I sort of read and speak Spanish like a third or fourth grader. So if we could keep everything to the present and past tense, I'm okay. But if you want to go like subjunctive or, future indicative mood, you've completely lost me. So I don't actually read the literature that's in Spanish, but I do read a lot of Puerto Rican literature by Puerto Ricans who are writing in English. So Judith Cortez Cofer, Esmeralda Santiago, P.D. Thomas, those kind of writers. But I currently don't have the tools to access the other literature, although I am working on it.
Okay.
David?
Seems to be a tension here in the story, and I think it's something that we probably don't engage enough between the relationship between Africa, Latin America, and the intersections in terms of identity. It's interestingly enough, I went to Puerto Rico this summer with my children, and the parts of Puerto Rico where the African, the most kind of phenotypically African Puerto Rican, yes. If you do all of the touristy stuff in terms of where you can go, that particular area, they say, it's really, really dangerous, but if you actually do the little testimonials, it's a huge disparity between like the whites who go into this space and the African Americans or Africans who go into this space. And there was one that was particularly striking where this African American man was like, I went to this space, I read all these negative reviews, and I looked around and people looked like me, and I was like, oh, and I just kind of moved through this space, and nobody, it wasn't like I stood out until I spoke, and I felt very much at home. It seems in the story that this kind of knowledge, this awareness of this Afrocentric aspect of that Puerto Rican culture is something that is magical in a very kind of redemptive, healing way. When you were, and this of course I think is very relevant in a southern Florida space where race is played out in very funky ways in terms of brown skin in this particular context. When you were writing and thinking about and putting the story together, how much of that kind of dynamic was playing into how you were constructing Rosa's character in particular, that kind of last scene where it seems like there's some kind of unity but also transcendence that is in some ways it seems one could connect to her knowledge of those different kinds of intersections of her identity.
Well, that's something that is not just sort of limited to characterization of Rosa, but it's an important part of the collection. The collection is currently sort of half-linked. So there are 5 stories that have Rosa, Yauba, Pedro, and then the 2 store owners. And she's a New Yorican, she's a New Yorker born in New York with Puerto Rican parents who has never learned to speak Spanish. Her parents, speak Spanish, have been in Puerto Rico, and she never has. So she tries to sort of access the culture and the language through her husband. But the other half of the collection are all about characters who are Afro-Puerto Rican. So they have one African-American parent, and then they have a Puerto Rican parent. So they're an extra generation or an extra layer of removal there. And then there's one story where all the characters from the half-linked, and then there's a grandson who embodies both, where I try to fuse both experiences into one. So one of the questions in the collection is, how is identity assumed or learned? Rosa sort of makes the mistake of picking what she thinks is the most like macho like Puerto Rican guy, and believing that like if she sort of marries him, she can absorb, this culture, and can just sort of learn it. But there's a question of who the teachers are, if the information is correct, what your own relationship is going to be to it, and then ways in which we use culture to exclude certain people. So sort of saying, well, if you don't know the language, you're not really Puerto Rican, or if you can't cook this, you're not really, or if you are too black, maybe you're not Puerto Rican enough. And that's part of something I'm trying to explore in the collection. There's this expression in Puerto Rican culture about like, yeah, but where's your grandmother, right? Like when the Puerto Ricans sort of say, well, no, I'm white. There's no African culture. It's like, okay, but ¿dónde está tu abuela? Right, you're white, and then two generations earlier, you look at a picture of your grandmother, and she's clearly someone who has African background. So that's part of what the collection is attempting to explore. Yeah.
So you're a really, really prolific writer, and
Thank
so
you.
you've got this great new collection, and many, many other stories, and I know many more to come. And so, and you just talked a little bit about the specific links here in operation and the questions that you're thinking about and so forth. Are there any overarching questions that you come back to over and over again? Or are there additional questions beyond this particular collection that that you're thinking about in the future? I guess I'm kind of asking, since you're so prolific, what questions drive you?
Too many questions, unfortunately. One of the questions that I would say relates to everything I've written is the ways in which people attempt to sort of slip out of identities. I'm thinking in terms of class, like all of my collections or all of my writing is frequently concerned with people who move through different layers or levels of class. Most likely people who have had impoverished or marginalized backgrounds who have come into sort of middle class spaces, how they sort of negotiate or see that lifestyle differently from someone who has always been raised that way, how they make those decisions. And that was a question that motivated the first collection, At Risk, because you had children, protagonists, and narrators who were using education to try to jump class. So they were trying to get scholarships or participate in enrichment programs so that they would have different lives than their parents did, or so they would be able to escape poverty or gang violence or different things like that. In this particular collection, one of the things I'm thinking about is that as well, because Yauba is someone who wants to eventually become an entrepreneur. He wants to be a restaurateur or a proprietor, and what is it that holds him back? He's not an immigrant, and yet he's frequently treated like one, which I think is an experience specific to Puerto Rican culture. Because Puerto Ricans are a Latino group who are automatically U.S. citizens at birth. You fly into Puerto Rico and it says, "Welcome to the United States." But there are ways in which they get elided into other cultures and the experience, and it's assumed that their experience is exactly the same as a Dominicans or Cubans or Colombians, and there may be many layers where things intersect, but the Jones Act, specifically distinguishes Puerto Ricans and puts them into a distinct category. So how do those characters attempt to jump class if they are sort of still being penalized for being immigrants and they're not even actually immigrants? That's something that the collection is interested in exploring. And I mentioned the owners of the bodega. So I'm interested in people who jump class in this particular collection because you get to think about what those proprietors have to give up in order to have this lifestyle. Every character in here does not necessarily have the same relationship to Puerto Rico. So there are characters in the collection who are like, we're Americans, we don't need to teach you Spanish, you just be here, everything is fine. And then there are characters in the story who are like, I don't want to be here, I want to go home. And the proprietors, the husband and wife, differ in terms of what they want. The wife is like, you know, I'll do this, I'll run this bodega so our son can have a better chance, but I would much rather be in Rio Piedras, which is why she sort of flies there in her mind. So those characters, I think, bring to light that struggle with jumping class. In a new collection that I'm currently working on called The Loss of All Lost Things, that is, I think, even more apparent because that collection is not unified by region or age the way the current two are. It's more about, it's all adults. It's set between 2000 and 2008 or 2009. And there are a lot of characters who are academics in some certain way. It's not a Romana Clay, I just got here. You know? Yes, you were all in the collection, you know. But that collection thinks about the way people deal with loss, but it also has characters who have become middle class because of their education, because of the colleges that they've attended and the jobs they've now taken, but who haven't grown up that way, and how they feel they need to sort of assimilate. You know, education-wise, everyone is the same, but in terms of people driving, in terms of their financial decisions, in terms of the way they discipline the children, you know, there are different responses based on the class in which you were raised. So those questions come out in that one. So I would say that's my biggest question. You know, how do people sort of jump class, and what kind of wounds do we take when we do? You know, because I think that's, you know, an American dream story, right? That you can start from the bottom. You'll start from the bottom, now we're here, right? You start from the bottom, and, you know, if you just have enough passion and desire, you can ascend and climb as high as you want to. But once you've ascended, if you don't know the code, or if you can't break the code, like, would you say or do one improper thing that identifies you as someone who doesn't really belong in that circle, you know, or can be sort of outed? And, you know, is your stay there permanent or temporary? That was a long answer, but she's my chair, so.
It was a great answer.
Thank you. Tim?
Thank you. It was a great story.
Thank you.
Read it really well.
I try.
Clearly, New York City has been crucial to this collection and the previous collection. I mean, following up on David's question, I know you've not been in Miami very long, but clearly race and ethnicity work in interesting and complicated ways in South Florida too, very differently from the way they do in New York. You've not been here very long, but can you see yourself writing about South Florida, writing about some of these questions and the way they're inflected differently here?
Well, I'm always open to new book projects. I currently have a list of 10 books that I'm trying to complete. So, you know, it could potentially become book 11. But to not be facetious, when I try to write about a place, I normally need to not be there when I'm writing about it. And I've noticed that I need about 4 years of immersion to really write about the place. So there are places where I've only lived for a short amount of time, Milwaukee for a year, St. Louis for 2 years, and I don't feel that I've lived in it enough or know it enough to write about it in a way that would be accurate so that a native could read it and be like, oh yeah, this is exactly what my city is like. And I can only write about New York now that I don't live there. And I lived in Philadelphia for 10 years, so, you know, a lot of my stories now go back to Philadelphia. So for me, I've noticed that after a certain length of time, the city or the state or the culture starts to, you know, embed itself in me, and I start looking at it as a person who lives here as opposed to a person who's just passing through. And that's part of what sort of characterizes when I try to represent a place. So, if you keep me around for 4 years, then Miami might figure its way into stories.
So,
Frank?
Amina, are there food scenes from other writers that you have when you are writing all these great scenes in the story there about food? And I also started worrying about whether you burn yourself a lot.
I guess that means the verisimilitude is working so that it seems real. But, I am an expert tostones maker. I never burn myself when I make tostones. But to answer your question, there are a lot of food scenes that resonate with me. It's funny because there are a lot of journals now that write food issues, and I don't actually like those. But, I think of the moment in The Dead, where they're having the dinner party, and there's the mint jelly, and, there's the roast and the different things, making sure that everyone gets to eat before they listen to this piano recital, and what a spread, is put out for this dinner party that these two elderly aunts frequently throw. And, there's a question of who's going to eat what, is this really national food? And then Gabriel gets sort of grilled on the dance floor. So I think of that moment. I think of the moment in Beloved where Baby Suggs and Setha go a little too far with throwing the picnic. It first starts out as something for the community to come and be involved in, and then it just grows into these proportions where afterwards it leaves everyone feeling resentful of Setha and Baby Suggs. So I think of that moment. I think a lot about food because I actually don't cook that often, but I think a lot about it when I'm writing stories about people who are jumping class, because it's linked to economics, like what kind of stores you have in your neighborhood. If you have to eat, if you're poor, you buy a lot of frozen and canned goods as opposed to being able to buy fresh things all the time. What your association is with that. If you have to prepare your own meals, if someone is preparing them for you, if you are a server. So I do think about that a lot, and I frequently have characters who are cooking things. The tostones in particular have a metaphorical value for me because it's just a plantain, but there are so many ways in which it can be prepared, and so I associate it with my character Rosa, who we'll see sort of grow and develop and evolve in further stories in this collection. So you can take a green plantain, you can make tostones, which is what I described, and it's a food that's twice cooked. Like you cut it, you fry it, then you mash it into tostonera, and you fry it again. But you can also mash it and make mofongo, which is another dish where you can let the plantain ripen, and you can make maduros, which is a sort of sweet side dish. So I think about this staple, right? Every culture has this one starchy staple that we eat when we're poor to sort of stretch out the meal. Rice, bread, plantains, yams, whatever it is. Like every culture has one, and you fill up on that thing, when you're poor. So I've used the plantain or the tostones to kind of think of the ways that it can grow and evolve and change, and to associate it with Rosa to see how she will move through her abusive marriage with Pedro and her affair with Yauba, and who she will be when she comes out on the end, because there are 3 more stories with her and those 3 characters in here. Anthony?
Yeah, the love that went into the preparation of the food made me think of Entisaki Shange and Sassafras.
Thank you.
Just a comment.
Hillary?
Yeah, Hillary, thank you. That was a beautiful story, and I love
Thank
the way
you.
that you read it. And so let me just preface my question by saying I know very little about Afro-Puerto Rico, but I'm a historian of Africa. And so I'm really, just to kind of go back to this question about identities, I think there's a wonderful sort of thread of diaspora that's in the story, and for many historians, we've conceived of African diaspora as that movement from Africa to the Americas. But you're sort of dealing with a tertiary movement, that there are people who are in a third leg of diaspora in which they're imagining home not as Africa, the imaginary continental homeland, but as Africa in Puerto Rico. So I'd wonder a little bit about if you have to problematize or think through what Africa means specifically in a Puerto Rican context as opposed to a Dominican context, or are there cultural markers, are there ways in which you have to make your readers familiar with when you say an African identity for your main character, not Rosa, but
Yahuba.
Yahuba. What are you trying to convey to your audience?
Well, I think I'm attempting to deal with both legs of diaspora in different stories. I know we've only, had this one, but one of the things that's sort of interesting about Puerto Rican culture is no one denies the presence of Africa. People frequently deny it in their own families, but no one, denies it because we're like, yeah, drums, salsa, how would you get this music without, these certain instruments that were created by slaves, that have a slave presence. So I guess one of the things I guess I don't feel that I have to work overly hard to problematize it, because I feel like it is something that's celebrated in Puerto Rican culture, even if it's not celebrated in people's specific families. Like Santeria, for example, is a Yoruba religion mixed with Catholicism, right? That's how you get it. So, everyone knows that and sort of understands that these African gods or this religion from Nigeria mixes with Catholicism to create Santeria. So it's not really being hidden anymore, but there's a story about how those things had to be hidden in previous centuries in order for it to be kept or revived in a culture. And I have a story, the title story is called Aguanile, which is a song by Hector Lavoe, and Aguanile is a Yoruba word. And that song was written because Hector Lavoe, the story is that the song was written because Hector Lavoe was maybe depressed or having some emotional or psychological stress and went to visit a Santeria priest. And that song specifically has words, it has Yoruba words in it, and the song pulls in animals from Africa, and it specifically sort of celebrates Africa in Puerto Rico. So the third leg, like you're saying. So I think one of the ways I try to do that is sort of obliquely and show that things are sort of embedded in the culture, even if specific characters have to find their way to those relationships.
I wanted to come back to my previous questions because I didn't want it to sound like you ought to be reading Puerto Rican writers in Spanish at all. But there's an interesting synergy right now with your work that I was really enjoying listening to, and two other writers, Afro-Puerto Rican writers who are writing in Spanish, Mayra Santos Febres and Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, and you all three seem to be trying to work out that issue of the presence of African, the negotiation of African identities and the Puerto Rican identity within the island, in the diaspora, in New York. And so that's what I thought it might be interesting to see the different sort of way of approaching the topic from the Spanish language point of view and then the English point of view, where both, all of your works mix both languages in them. So that's just a comment.
Well, no,
I encourage you to read these people too, because they're really good.
Well, I didn't take it, as an admonition that I ought to, but I mean, it's something that I would like to do. I would like to be fluent in Spanish, and I sort of deliberately stopped on purpose for writer's reasons, right. Which is to say that I don't want to tell all my projects with my chair sitting here, because then I have to actually do them. But I guess even though this is being videotaped, I guess I'll tell everybody the truth. These stories came out of a novel draft. I had drafted a novel about Rosa years ago in 2004, 2005 called Preciosa. And I thought it was a novel, and it was really a long summary. And I pulled certain chapters out and developed them into short stories that became the short stories that have Rosa, Yauba, and Pedro in this collection. But I'm still interested in writing a novel that looks at her growth and development and still calling it Preciosa. And I decided when I first started writing about her, I was like, oh, well, if I'm going to write about this character, I should finish taking Spanish and I should become fluent in it. And then I realized that that's not her experience, and I would know more than she would know. And so I sort of paused my sort of language education so that my experience more closely mirrors hers as I'm trying to write about what it feels like, you know, to have people look at you and just speak Spanish, to not know what's going on, to know a little bit, and then maybe people hear you speak a little bit and they just think you know the rest, and to feel like you're sort of caught between two languages. And forcing myself to stay in that space gives me an opportunity to think about what her options are and what kind of moves she'll make to try to get out of the space and what kind of risks she will be willing to take. So I can't finish learning Spanish until I finish the book. And that's what I decided a while ago. David?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna mess with you a little bit because.
What else is new?
Because I'm almost done with the collection, the At Risk, and so I'll call Amina every couple of days and be like, I like this story, but this I found this to be problematic, or how did you do this? And one of the things that I had said, you know, I asked, which you never ask writers, but I asked anyway. And I was talking about, you know, the relationship between the personal and the creative, and made a comment about that there was ways in which you take something that actually really happened, but then you build a kind of narrative around it, and that you obviously, you know, if a character, you forget the particular character we were talking about, but you're like, well, I'm kind of a woman, so you know, I was writing from a little boy's perspective, so you know, creative writer.
That was the Ease of Living
yes.
story.
And so it's interesting when you talk about not learning Spanish in this context, because you seem to be embodying the personal in very interesting ways in terms of channeling that particular character. Can you talk to some degree about what your research process is in terms of your creative process when you try to, you've talked some about how inhabiting a space, a physical space, geographical space, that there seems to be a time limit of that occupation, and then there needs to be a remove from that to be able to engage it. Can you talk to some degree about how you go about, like even with the context of you said, I thought I was writing a novel, like how do you immerse yourself in a particular kind of project, and how does that creative process work for you?
Well, I do a lot of research for everything I write, and each process is a little different, but I always start first with my own writing and not the research, because I don't want to be, you know, like when you're an undergrad and you've read all these books and you really only needed 5 to write your paper, but you read them and you want the professor to know that you read them, so you just dump them in there for like no reason, just to prove that you did it. So I noticed that when I start with the research, I stop writing a story and I start just disseminating information. You know, so I start with 2 different things. One, questions, like Pam asked about, wanting to know why these people do this, or what would have happened if this person did one thing differently. If, you know, if like in the Bugs Bunny cartoons, like if you took a left at Albuquerque instead of a right, where would you have ended up? And it's a totally different map if you just go a different way. So I start with, you know, just one question about changing something, and I start with a visual image, like what I want to see in the story, and I try to write towards that. And And then after that, I do research. So I make sure I have a nucleus for a story that I think I want to tell. And then I start to do the research. So for short stories, I only need maybe 3 to 6 months of research, which can frequently be interviewing people who have the occupations that I'm writing about that I don't know anything about, maybe shadowing them for a couple of days, and I just sort of pay them by buying them dinner. So a mixture of that. So for instance, my uncle used to be a cook at in Gramercy Park at a place that the Salvation Army owned. So the space where Yahuba works is a space where my uncle worked. So I would, when I was living in Philadelphia, I would take the train to New York and just kind of sit there on his shifts and watch what was happening in the kitchen. Occasionally I'd wash a couple of dishes. But I would just go there for weeks and weeks and weeks to kind of see what was happening. So there's observation, then there's sort of immersion research where I'm interviewing people and just reading books and just looking up things on the internet. So for instance, I interviewed a few people who were on dialysis to understand Rosa's father's dilemma, and just how it feels and what kind of misdiagnoses the doctors might give you. So for a short story, that just takes maybe 3 to 6 months. For the novels, I realized I need to go much further, because I only need a certain amount of information to convey a space that only needs to exist for 10 or 15 pages. But if I'm going to convey a space that's going to exist for 250 to 300 pages, then I need much more detailed research. Two of the stories in the collection that I'm finishing, for example, are about a kidnapped boy. And I spent 3 years doing the research for what ended up being 18 pages of story. A 10-page story and an 8-page story. So I had watched like one of those things, THS or E! Online, some kind of show on TV about children and teenagers who had been kidnapped, and I was like, whoa. So then I went and read about every teenager who'd been kidnapped since the 70s, right? Because the rules have changed, Amber Alert and all of that. I purchased the transcripts to the show because it wouldn't re-air, and I needed to get that information again. I did not interview any parents who had kidnapped children. I, drew the line at that, but I watched a lot of documentaries and videos and read a lot of testimonials from adults now who had been kidnapped as teenagers and who were now free and living their lives. So for that, I needed to do about 3 years of research to feel like I could write those stories in a way that wouldn't be exoticizing the kidnapped body, or that wouldn't be just making the kidnapper sound like, a Jeffrey Dahmer or, some sort of serial killer or kidnapper that is sort of a celebrity or that has had celebrity status in our culture. And then I also had to take breaks in between that because it was really emotional. So there were like some months after reading the transcript where I just didn't mess with the story at all. So depending on what I'm writing about, the research looks different. The stories in At Risk were all in neighborhoods that I lived in, that I grew up in. The experiences in private school and in public school were not specifically mine, but I had inhabited those spaces and I saw what the class clowns did or what other children did, so I could sort of write from a position where I felt like I had some authority. But then I also went and read books on gifted children, books by admissions officers and counselors, to make sure that to sort of unite what I understood as a small cog, with a sort of microcosmic vision, with getting the sort of macrocosmic information, and to unite both of those things together. William. Sorry.
You said you start your stories off first and foremost with your own ideas, your own voice, your own vision. Has there ever been a situation where afterwards you do the research and the research somehow changes the trajectory of the story?
Yes, that definitely can happen. It can sort of move me in a different way or make me think of something. Sometimes it can turn what I thought was one story into sort of two different stories. Like there's what I initially wanted to tell, and maybe the research gave me a different idea, so I split them, and they become two different things. But if I start with my own imagery first, and I feel like the research can only take me in a place that maybe I want to go or that I need it to go, as opposed to starting with the research first, and then I just feel like I'm just doing something that's like reportage and just sort of journalistic. Because the more research I do, I start out with an assumption. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but everybody has a hypothesis. So I'm like, this is what I think I'm going to find. This is what I think this experience is going to be like. And sometimes the research is like, you're just dead wrong. and now it's like this. So I have to say, okay, well, what does that look like, and what does that mean, and what happens with this new information? I'm not big on trying to force something to fit my idea of it, which is why I take a really long time to write my stories. That's why it can take me like 6 months to 3 years to write one short story, because I have the idea that I think I want to write, and then we have a little mental struggle with, no, you're going to write this story, and the research is like, but you learned all this new information now, and now that story is too thin. Now you have to deepen what you want to say. Madam President.
How much time do you spend monthly writing in your writing? And you said that you have 10 books that you've already started. How do you decide which one you're going to go back to 2 or 3 months from now, or which one's going to be finished first, or are they all connected? And I'm assuming that they're not.
All connected. they're not all connected. I think different writers have sort of different rules. So I'm very strict with myself about having to write often. But I'm not the sort of writer that says, I get up every morning, 7 a.m., I write from 7 to 9, I have 1 cup of coffee and 1 banana, and I'm done. Like one of the reasons that I love being a writer is that I feel that it makes me one of the most independent people on the planet, that I do what I want when I want to do it. So giving myself that kind of schedule takes all the joy out of writing for me. I like to write for very long periods of time. So my preferred or ideal way of writing is to kind of get up and write until I fall asleep. So I'd like to write for anywhere from 12 to 16 hours. That is what I prefer, which means that I don't do that on days I teach. So, and I just discovered that this year when I was on residencies, that, when I write that way, the first 2 or 3 hours are just, a lot of cliches, a lot of like dull, boring language that doesn't need to be there. But if I sit and I stay, then eventually the language rises to the level that I want. So I give myself the kind of freedom to move back and forth between projects, because I just have a really short attention span, and I get like super bored. And it's worked for me because I've never had writer's block, because I write multiple projects. So if I'm working on something and I get stuck, or if I just feel that the energy and the joy has like been sucked out of it, I just, I just let myself know, okay, just leave that document there, open up this other file. So I'll just go with whatever interests me at that moment, and then later on I can come back to the thing that I felt was boring, and it's no longer boring. So the question is, how do I know which one I'm going to write? And I really don't always know. Like, I'll open up a document and I'll work on that story for 2 or 3 days, and I'm like, this is totally boring. I don't even want to write this. This story sucks. And then I just save it and put it away. And I might do it with 2 or 3 documents until I get to the one where I'm writing it so long that I forgot to eat dinner. and then I know that that's where I'm going to stay for a few months. So I'm just always working on multiple projects at the same time, and then once I get really interested, I focus for a few months to a year, then that's the project that moves closer to completion before the other one. Blank pages really scare me. Like if I sit down at a document and it's blank and I say to myself, you have to write a story or you have to write a novel, I'll never write one. But I jot down words, metaphors, dialogue, ideas like on paper, and then I transcribe them into documents, give it a title, save it, and leave it. And then I open it up one day and I'm like, oh, there's a story already here. So I don't really have to write it. I just have to kind of move the paragraphs around, and lo and behold, there's a story. I mean, that's not true, but I trick myself into believing that, and so it helps me get started.
So in your freedom to not structure a 7 to 9 time that you're going to get up and write every day, there is some structure in your writing though. And with your it seems as if there's a lot of spontaneity too.
There is with whatever the specific project is going to be, but it's weird. I'm kind of like anal in certain ways. So I have a notebook, and each project has a page, and like every question that I need to answer, all the research that I need to do, it's listed. All the main characters, like that's there. But I write it and then I put it away and I don't look at it. So I write it down and then I pretend that it's not there and that I can do whatever I want. It works for me.
All right, then. Thanks very much. All right, so then if there are no more questions, a reminder for our internet audience watching at home that you can call the number on your screen, purchase a copy of Now We Will Be Happy. We'll get it signed for you, and we'll ship it to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. Also a reminder that all of our live streamed events are archived, so if you don't get a chance to watch them live, you can go to the Books and Books website, and they will be saved there for you to watch at your convenience. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter over there, as well as Professor Gautier's previous collection, At Risk. She will be signing over here at the table to the left of the podium, and this is her first visit to Books and Books, so please let's give her another big hand. Thanks for
Thank you.
Thank you.